We can look now at what happened and what lessons were learned with Milo Comerford, who's from the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, a not-for-profit think tank which looks at tackling extremism. Milo, hello.
Hello.
Hello. A simple question, I suppose. Could they have been prevented, those attacks?
Attacks could always have been prevented. There's always what we call leakage from attackers, where they reveal their intentions, they reveal their plotting, they reveal their attempts to operationalize their plans. So I think there's always an ability to look back and think about what's been missed and what could have been caught. But certainly I think the policy approaches that have followed in the wake of the 7/7 attack are much more focused on preventing extremism and radicalization rather than just dealing with its after effects.
I mean, and obviously we know that attacks have been prevented since. And I wonder if that goes back to the lessons learned by the various authorities and various institutions that day.
That's right, yes. There was a sort of great moment of introspection in the immediate aftermath, a sort of soul-searching around how this came to happen and what the weaknesses were in preparedness around attacks like this. And that really did inform a kind of top-to-tail change in how counterterrorism was approached and trying to get much more upstream. So trying to reach the root causes and the drivers of this challenge rather than just viewing it purely through a reactive policing lens.
So in terms of what's changed then, in terms of those lessons learned?
Well, in many ways, the 7/7 attacks really catalysed an approach to countering terrorism that started in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. The UK government had started to think about what a counterterrorism strategy might look like in that context, and then really accelerated it in the aftermath of the attacks. And that's when we saw, this really consolidating and an attempt at prevention being much more at the heart of responses. So in the immediate aftermath, there was that learning. And then really over the past 20 years, to some extent, the strategy has reflected the shifting threat landscape. And you've seen new things bolted on over the years, from attempts to address other forms of extremism and terrorism beyond Islamism, to look at the far right, to require public sector officials to give due regard to countering terrorism, and more recently to sort of address this much more diverse threat landscape that is challenging us. You think of events like Southport last year and the attacker that slipped through prevent referrals 3 times, and again soul-searching once more around what could be done better to prevent that kind of violence in the country.
Nicky was obviously talking about this earlier on his programme, and Paul in Penrith messaged, and who asks, what motivated the 7/7 bombers to do what they did? Has any investigation tried to establish why they did it? Maybe the way to understand the bombings is to investigate the motivations behind their actions. No use just reiterating what happened. Need reasons. Why?
Yes, and I think there has been a lot of poring over of the motivations of those attackers and others. They were inspired by Islamist extremist ideology. They believed that there was a apocalyptic war between Islam and the West, a kind of very politicized vision of a supremacist ideology that translated into violence. They were directly inspired by the leaders of Al-Qaeda, of figures like Osama bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, out in Afghanistan. But of course, they were also inspired by the environment at the time, including in the aftermath of the Iraq War, a sort of general grievance around Western foreign policy. And so often we see this sort of hybridization of grievances, of ideology to inspire attacks. And I think that is certainly a characteristic that we still see with the extremist violence that we face today.
I mean, can we ever be safe from extremist ideology?
Extremist ideology, of course, can manifest in a number of different ways. It's not just violent. We see that sort of supremacist vision, and that often attacks minorities and so on. That can be spread through politics at the ballot box. It's the sort of terrorism, I suppose, the tactics that are employed here that are perhaps the main focus of certainly policing responses to this. And certainly there's been a whole-scale approach to getting ahead of these issues, to better protecting infrastructure, to pursuing those who are involved, and really the sort of apparatus that is developed to address terrorist violence before it manifests in some of the horrific scenes we saw in 2005.
In terms of terrorism, do we have a clear definition of what is terror?
So there is a definition in the Terrorism Act of 2000. So that is now 25 years old, that definition. And it really is rooted in the notion of specific harms, including violence, and actually more recently with the case of the proscription of Palestine action, the implementation of serious damage to property. But that has to be combined with a clear ideology and an attempt to influence government. So there is this definition that sits within law. Unfortunately, this is increasingly challenged by many of the threats we face today that perhaps you might think of as terrorism. So attackers that are inspired perhaps not by a neat ideology, but rather by a broader set of grievances, of hatred, or perhaps just general violent ideation. I mentioned earlier the Southport attacker and how he was able to slip through the net of the PREVENT program. That's because he didn't have a clear ideology, a clear extremism, but rather, adopted terrorist tactics, including downloading an Al-Qaeda training manual, but without a clear ideological framework. And this is really challenging the systems that are in place to tackle this kind of violence, because it's really been built around the threats like that we saw that guided 7/7. Clearly ideological extremism, and often that associated with specific prescribed groups like that of Al-Qaeda. So that definition is being increasingly tested, Naga, and I think that the threat that we face today is certainly challenging authorities.
And when you say it's 25 years old, that definition, do you believe it needs updating?
Well, as I mentioned, I think that increasingly trying to establish an ideology is quite difficult when so many attackers now are very much radicalized within online ecosystems. They're not part of specific groups or organizations. They are actually part of these online worlds where they might be being exposed to violent subcultures. They might even be influenced by a range of different forms of extremism. They might be very interested in school shootings, for example, like the Southport attacker. They might be exposed to different forms of extremism. Some, are inspired by far-right and Islamist extremism within these online spaces. And I think in that case, the sort of focus on ideology can be quite challenging, and to some extent is increasingly counterintuitive for many of the threats that really do resemble terrorism in many ways, but don't necessarily have that ideological component. So if I was going to point to a major point of difference in the last 2 decades to the terrorism threats we face today and now, I think that sort of long tail of extremism that is hard to pin down is something that has really challenged authorities over the past few years.
Milo Comerford from the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, a not-for-profit think tank which looks at tackling extremism. Thanks very much for your thoughts with me this afternoon.
Thank you.